Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Part 3, Chapter 2, Part 1. Subsection 1. There was no doubt about it, thought Aunt Anna, as, with Jim, she set out to join the shooters at lunch on the day before Lord Maresfield was to leave. There was no doubt but that the mysterious movement of autumn had begun, the third of the year's great symphonies. 3 days ago, summer had ended on a full close, the day that Lord Maresfield had come. The woods had stood erect and confident for the last time. It was the day, too, she learned next day, on which Neville had actually bathed, all alone, after dinner. They had talked about it at breakfast next morning. The wind had got up that night. The clouds had come. And when she had gone out to give the collies and Jim a run, after the early Mass, the first faint agitation of the new season was in the air. Today, the last shred of doubt was gone. The motif, so to say, was announced. For there was come, over the face of the woods, a definite tint that had not been there last week. The key had changed into the minor. The trees were still opulent and full-leaved, the grass still heavy and luxuriant. The warmth was practically as great as 3 days ago. Yet the thing was there. Jim was a shade silent this morning. He had secretly hoped that he would be allowed to start with the shooters after breakfast, and had appeared, gaitered and capped, with an assured air, so soon as the keeper came up with the beaters. Lessons, he had seemed to think, would melt as inevitably as morning mists before the sun, in the glory of the first day after the partridges. He had been undeceived, in spite of Neville's intercession, and sent back to take off his gaiters. Anna had been a little astonished that Neville had pleaded for him, out loud, in his presence, but she could not relent. Jim's lessons were beginning to rest rather heavily on her conscience, and more than ever now that Downside was postponed till further notice. "You must keep close," she said as they came out through the belt of trees towards the approach to the valley where lunch was to be. "You'll remember, won't you?" "Oh, I know all about that," said Jim indifferently, trudging along with his hands in his pockets and an ash plant under his arm in imitation of Mr. Dane, the keeper. He presented a very sturdy and resolute little figure. It was a very charming view on which presently they looked, as they came out from the trees and halted. Beneath, a sharp little valley, enclosed in woods, sloped away into broad flatness at the lower end on the right, and rose to a point at the upper end on the left. It was usually the last drive before lunch, as the keeper's cottage stood conveniently at the edge of the woods on the extreme point of the valley, and the bird had a way of taking refuge here after the drives in the open country to the right. From where the two stood, the whole strategy was plainly visible, for they were at a point about halfway up the valley. They could see the line of beaters moving up from the right, and the 3 guns in ambush behind little clumps of may trees that dotted the pasture on the left. It was possible even to make out which was which. Neville was nearest to them, in his grey suit, perhaps 100 yards away, and 50 feet below their level. Lord Maresfield next, in the middle, in russet brown, and Algy Lennox beyond, in a delicate green. They had arrived, too, exactly in time, and would see the drive from beginning to end. The sun, come out for a little space from the clouds, stood high behind them, and the valley was full of light from the green pasture where the guns stood, across the mustard patch halfway, down to the newly cut stubbles and pasture, again, up which the beaters came. As soon as the birds began to arrive, it was evident that Neville was in form. He had seemed very cheerful at breakfast, and had talked almost in his old way. For the first 3 coveys came straight over him, and each time it was possible to make out they left 2 of their number behind. Each time there was a sudden halt, and a cry from the line of tiny, doll-like figures that laboured slowly upwards. Something white waved vigorously, and then Anna could make out a moving pattern of dots, scarcely changing their relative positions as they came, slide across the background, blackish-looking against the yellow of the mustard, brown again against the green meadowland. Then, as they approached, came the shots, in each case from Neville, one as they approached and one as they passed on, and the covey was smaller by 2. Jim stood dead silent, trembling a little, drawing his breath sharply as the shots were fired. "Ooh!" said Jim after the 6th. The last covey of that drive, numbering at least a dozen birds, broke from the nearer edge of the mustard as the beaters entered at the other, and dispersed wildly. And simultaneously, a hare burst out of the ground. There were shots in all directions, at least 3 from Algy and 2 from Lord Maresfield, as well as another from Neville. Then the 2 spectators came out from the edge of the wood to make their way downwards. Anna was glad that Neville had had so much shooting, and that he had acquitted himself so well. She often found herself watching him during these days. Subsection 2. He was in the highest spirits at lunch, and flushed with exercise, looked as well as he had ever looked in his life. He came round the corner briskly, from laying aside his gun in an outhouse, into the low, wide living room where lunch was laid. "Algy, you bungled that last drive disgracefully. Where's my hare that I wanted to eat?" "Your hare's sitting in a ditch. At least I saw him go in, and he never came out again." "Did you fire twice at him? I couldn't see." "Please, the sun was in my eyes, and I couldn't see. And the ball shot, and it was a fast wicket, and I'm not feeling very well." "Well, I am, thank God. Oh, Aunt Anna. Mutton pies. And don't do it again, Algy. Beer, anybody?" It was really very picturesque here in this raftered room. Through the lattices the sun streamed in upon the white-laid table, the aluminium boxes of food, the glass and silver, the great glass jug of beer. The walls were brightly papered between the upright beams. A rack of old guns hung over the high fireplace. A kettle sang on the hob. The men, too, looked healthy and exercised. Jim looked charmingly childish. She herself, if she had known it, with her grey hair and young face, was the most picturesque of them all. A flush of pleasure swept over Anna. It was also very healthy and reassuring. It was only at moments like this, yet at none before so strongly, that she realized that vague burden of anxiety that she always carried at other times. Yet she scarcely knew about what she was anxious. There was no question that he had borne his trouble finely, and that it had left none but the most superficial marks. It was obvious, she thought, that he was better than he had been even 6 months ago. He had not even an hour's headache, so far as she knew, since the night on which she had sat by him. Then what in the world did she feel anxious about? The shadow of which Mr. Morpeth had spoken had surely done its worst. "Jim," said Neville, "what have you done with your stick?" "I have left it outside, Cousin Neville," explained Jim. "Like your gun." He bit into a mutton pie. "Oh, I see. Did you take the cartridges out?" Jim disposed of his mouthful solemnly, regarding Neville as he did so. "I always take out the cartridges before putting it down anywhere," he said at last. "That's right, old man." "There are 23 partridges, 12, 11.5 braces," observed Jim presently. "Well done, my boy," said Aunt Anna. Jim's arithmetic was a weak point. He turned a cold eye on her. "And 3 hares, and a bird I don't know the name of." "That must be one of Algy's," said Neville. "It's a black-looking bird with blue—" "Jay, one of mine, what?" said Maresfield. "Got him in the woods." "Why did you shoot him?" inquired Jim, anxious for information. "Steals eggs, old man. No end, eh?" Why do you always say eh? That'll do, Jim, remarked his mother. Eh? What? Began Maresfield, and then he laughed loudly. She liked Lord Maresfield thoroughly, but he was a very odd mixture. Yesterday he had sat out all afternoon making a perfectly charming sketch of the pavilion on a little wooden panel of which he carried 2 or 3 always in his flat travelling paint-box. When it was quite finished, Jim had come out and inquired what it was meant to be. And now today he looked a competent sportsman. She perceived that he was distinguished from his type by a streak of art that he had never learned to be ashamed of. He was very pleasant always to Jim, too, and never exchanged glances with grown-up people while he answered him. She liked that. She often found Jim a good touchstone. She made up her mind that she would have a little talk to Lord Maresfield before he left. "We'll do the down last thing," said Neville presently, feeling for his pipe. "In honour of you, Maresfield." The other inquired what this might be. Neville explained that the down was a steep grass slope with roots at the bottom. Driven properly, it furnished the best beat of the day. Driven improperly, nothing happened whatever. They would drive it properly this afternoon. The guns would be stationed in a kind of dry ditch with a view against the sky. "They come as thick as peas," he said, "in a good year. We ought to do pretty well this afternoon. Birds aren't too shy yet." Subsection 3. It was within an hour of sunset when they began to take their places for the last drive, and the sky was beginning, ever so delicately, to show a premonitory flush. The afternoon had been delightful. She had never meant to keep Jim out so long, but she simply had not the heart to take him away. She contented herself by a word to him that he must do his lessons better than ever tomorrow morning. Jim had regarded her with a detached kind of air. He was in another world altogether by now. He was very conscientious, too, in his attentions to the sportsmen, and attached himself by turns to each. She had asked each privately to send him back to her if he was troublesome, but his reports were excellent. He remained quite motionless. He spoke in a whisper, and not too much, and he collected all the empty cartridge cases at the end of every drive. The pockets of his jacket bulged with them by now. His face wore a rapt expression. They had really done very well, and the shooting had been excellent. She herself had stood now with one and now with another, and there was not much to choose between them. Above 40 brace of birds, besides extras, were laid out at the end of the last drive, before the sportsman descended to the dry ditch in the hollow. It was her turn with Lord Maresfield now, and she led him, since he did not know the ground, with infinite precautions, lest the birds should be alarmed, under cover of a rise in the ground, out to the extreme left. Algy would be next, in the middle, and Neville on the right. The 3 guns were quite enough. The slopes rose on either side up to copses, sufficiently high to steer all but the most obstinate birds over the hedge of death. When they reached the position, she sat down on a convenient bank. "There's plenty of time," she said in a low voice. "The beaters will be 10 minutes yet. They've got to go right round behind, you know." He sat down beside her and took out his pipe and pouch. "He's on the spot, eh?" he said, without even mentioning Neville's name. "Told me so anyhow. Looks like it, what?" Neville had indeed distinguished himself by a very swift right and left at the end of the last drive. "Lord Maresfield," she said, "I want to ask you something. Do you know my nephew well?" "Eh? Well, pretty well, I suppose. Good chap. Very impertinent of me to say that. Like him immensely." "I thought you did. And you've heard about his trouble, I suppose?" He nodded, without speaking, and somehow she liked that too. Above all, She liked him for not saying that everyone had heard of it. "I think it was with Miss Bessington that you first met him." "That's it," he said. "Academy, wasn't it?" "I want to know what you think, if you don't mind telling me. I mean, whether you think it is a misfortune or not." He puffed at his pipe an instant. "I think it's a very good thing," he said suddenly. "Not suitable, you know, eh?" Her heart warmed to hear him. "Well, I thought so too, you know. And you don't think it's done my nephew any harm? He's not different at all, is he, from when you first got to know him?" Again he puffed for a moment before answering. "Dare say it's all my fancy," he said. "But—" "Yes?" "Seems a bit more apart, don't you know? More silent somehow, eh? At least, I thought so till today. Natural enough, though. But I didn't see very much of him in town, you know." "And today you think he's better again?" she pursued, disregarding his explanations. Somehow she felt a confidence in this man's opinion, and wanted to know what he thought. "Why, yes. Talked first rate at lunch, eh?" She sat, silent and relieved. It was not just her fancy, then, that his spirits were beginning to come back. She felt very grateful to Lord Maresfield for agreeing with her. She said so presently, in a word or two. Meanwhile, in his corner in the dry ditch over on the left, Neville, if only they had known it, could emphatically have corroborated the views of his friends. It seemed to him as if this new spirit that had come to him and whispered to him so coherently only 3 days ago had more than kept its promises. The air and exercise of this long day, the genial warmth and sunlight, his own success, the pleasantness of the party, all these things combined to make him very content. Over him rose the faintly flushing sky, clear now of clouds, the grasses that fringed his horizon in front, the tops of the copses which he could see on either side against the sky, the general sense of well-being. All these appeared, as nature will appear to sympathetic humanity, to adapt themselves exquisitely to his own individual point of view. Again, as he mused over a cigarette, waiting for the beaters, he told himself that he had found his balance once more, that his instincts, the other night, had been right, that a man who is sane and healthy is best at home with his own great mother, that God and man may be very well for the specialists in emotion, but that those who do not aim at being emotional had better leave such things alone, beyond, so to speak, a bowing acquaintance with them. After all, what more could he want? God was too remote. Men and women were too near. A man was his own best friend, or at least could make himself so. What more could he want? He had his health again, his position, his wealth, the companionship of Anna and Jim, and congenial friends. An excellent thing, this companionship, so long as it was not emotional. And he had found all this out for himself, at a certain considerable price, it is true, but the price was now paid, and the article was his. Never again would he trust emotion. It had led him wildly wrong, at least twice. He had thought both God and Enid other than what they were. Very well. He was initiated now. He had found his grail. He would drink it sedately and steadily as it deserved. And if a little cynicism was mixed in that cup, if, for the future, he found himself just despising women a little, and finding men clumsy, if he grew a little materialistic in his philosophy, and took more pains about the perfection of his bodily rather than his spiritual health, well, the sweetest cup was none the worse for a little sour spicing. "I think they might be coming soon," said Anna in a low voice. "Shall I be all right here?" "That's all right," said the man shortly. He beat out his pipe softly, opened and snapped to again the breech of his gun, and slipped to his feet. The sky had perceptibly deepened in colour during the last 10 minutes, revealing what the eye had scarcely taken in before. A multitude of tiny, fleece-like clouds ranged, it seemed, in a great curved vault down towards the west. The sun was behind the hill on their right, and the slope up which the position looked was in shadow. But the ditch was so deep in which Anna sat and her companion stood, that nothing but the sky was to be seen over the brow by which the birds would come, and so wide that it would be possible to loose the first barrel as they topped the horizon. The second barrel must be fired behind the line. As Anna looked along the line westwards, first 2 caps were very visible, one of the greenish tint that went with Algy's clothes, the other of the brown which Jim had been allowed to choose for himself. Those caps were visible, close to one another, as if their owners were discussing some high matter together. It was beyond all reasonable doubt, all things considered, that Jim was being allowed to handle his friend's empty gun. The rest of them was hidden by a break in the bank on which they sat. Quite clear and detached, however, 40 yards further on, was the grey figure of Neville, seen against a bramble patch on the slope of the hill. It was the sudden appearance of this figure, gun in hand, that had caused her to speak. Neville was obviously alert. Perhaps he had caught some sound or sight coming down the ground. The world, however, seemed perfectly quiet, wrapped in a sunset calm. It really seemed a little hard, thought Anna, on the birds, that they should be routed by stick-wielding apparitions and sent skimming once more down the long slopes, out of their fragrant coverts, just when a Sabbath peace descended on the earth. The sky looked like a vault whose lines were strewn by those mackerel clouds. Behind the line, as she turned her head to look, lay the meadows and the beginning of the park proper, clear of the shadow of the hill, bright in the last hour of sunshine. 2 sudden explosions to the right brought her back from beauty to sport. Algy had fired twice, and when she looked, the 2 caps had parted company. The green, supported by Algy's head and shoulders, stood up clear. The brown remained motionless in its original position. As she looked, Neville too raised his gun and fired once. Then began for her that confused state of the spectator who watches shooting from the side of a shooter, for the birds began to come immediately overhead. She crouched lower on her seat, so that she should not distract her companion, hearing now and again, as from another world, the reports from further up the line, but with her nerves braced to bear the shots fired in her immediate neighbourhood. Covey after covey came over. Neville indeed had been right in saying that they ought to do pretty well at the Down this afternoon. They whirred up, suddenly visible against the sky, 20 yards ahead, to be met by one barrel and speeded by another as they sank behind. It was impossible for her to know, except very rarely, how her companion fared. 2 or 3 times only did she catch sight of that strange transformation that takes place when one bird in a covey passes in an instant from the high intensity of life to the passivity of death, and only once did she hear the thud of its body over the bank behind. He seemed satisfied, however. He fired, wheeled, fired again, and reloaded, swiftly and mechanically. Now there came a pause when he waited. Now he tore at his pocket to snatch out another cartridge or 2. It was not till a final pause came, at the end of which he drooped his gun and relaxed his tense attitude, that she looked again down the line. And there, to her astonishment, Neville was sitting on the bank, smoking a cigarette, with no glimpse of a gun visible. As she stared, Mr. Dane's ruddy face appeared over the top of the bank. "Pretty good lot of birds, my lord," he said. "Hope your lordship had plenty of shooting?" "First rate, eh?" She waited a minute or 2 as Lord Maresfield stood on top of the bank, directing Mr. Dane and one of the beaters as to the line in which his birds had mostly fallen, and for that minute thought no more of Neville. but when she turned again, her surprise came back. The grey figure was still seated on the bank, but there was a little group of 3 about him. Algy and Jim formed 2/3, and the other was one of the elder beaters. They appeared to be regarding the sitting figure. She said nothing to her companion, but began to walk towards them. She was not yet exactly uneasy, but she wondered why Neville was sitting down, why Algy and Jim and the beater were looking at him. That was all. "Absolutely no good, my dear man," she heard him say as she came near. "Couldn't see a thing." He looked unusually flushed and upset, she thought. He was drawing almost savagely upon his cigarette. "What's the matter?" she asked. "Couldn't see. Chucked it," he said. She ran her eyes over him, vaguely uneasy. "How do you mean, my dear?" And then she saw that the hand that held the cigarette was shaking violently. Surely he couldn't be as angry as all that. "I couldn't see," he repeated steadily. Jim was staring on him with solemn eyes of reproachful wonder. "You hardly fired at all," he said. "No, old man." "Are you going blind, Cousin Neville? Like the game?" She saw a very strange expression pass over his face. At first she thought it to be anger. Then she perceived that, at any rate, it was not all anger. "Game?" she asked. Neville got up. His whole bearing seemed odd and unusual. "Yes, someone's having a game with me," he said softly, and his voice shook.